Hi, my name is Helen. Please listen to my story because it is one I have carried in silence for most of my life. Some might call it ordinary, but to me it was everything. And the truth is, for years, I felt like a stranger in my own home. I was 24 when I married, not very young by the standards of my town, but still with enough innocence to believe that love could conquer anything. I had grown up in a small village where the streets smelled of fresh bread in the morning, and the church bells told us when to rise, when to work, and when to rest. My parents were hard-working people, not rich, but proud that their daughter was steady, kind, and capable. When I met my husband, Thomas, I thought my life had finally found its shape. He wasn't the most handsome man, but he had a certain confidence about him. He spoke with a voice that carried authority, and people respected him in church gatherings. I thought, if I stand beside this man, I will always be safe. On our wedding day, I wore a plain white dress, sewn carefully by my mother's hands. The church smelled faintly of lilies, and a few neighbors clapped when we exchanged vows. Thomas squeezed my hand and whispered, "You will be happy with me, Helen." You'll see, in that moment, I believed him with all my heart. The first weeks after the wedding were a blur of newness. I moved into his family's home, a large but aging house with wooden floors that creaked in the night. His mother, stern-faced and sharp-eyed, greeted me with a nod that felt more like judgment than welcome. His sister, Margaret, barely looked at me at all, as though I were a visitor passing through instead of a new part of the family. I told myself not to worry. They just need time, I thought. After all, I was an outsider walking into a family that had lived together for years. I wanted to believe that kindness and patience would open their hearts. So, I worked hard. Each morning, I rose before the sun, lit the fire, and set water to boil. I cooked breakfast for everyone, bread toasted golden, eggs fried crisp, coffee steaming in tin mugs. I scrubbed the floors until my knees ached, washed laundry by hand until my skin cracked, and still smiled when they passed me without a word. One evening, as I placed dinner on the table, Thomas's mother tasted the stew, frowned, and said, "Too salty. Do it better next time." I looked down, ashamed, but forced myself to answer softly, "Yes, Mother." Later, when I whispered to Thomas in the quiet of our room, "She doesn't seem to like me," he only sighed and rolled onto his side. "Just ignore it, Helen," he said. "She'll come around." But she didn't come around. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and I remained invisible, except when something was wrong. If the laundry wasn't folded precisely, if the floor showed a speck of dust, if the bread was baked a shade too dark, I was reminded. Still, I held on to hope. In my heart, I thought, one day, she will see that I am trying. One day, I will belong. I remember a Sunday afternoon vividly. The house smelled of soap and roast meat. The church bells had just finished ringing, and I carried a basket of freshly folded clothes to the upstairs rooms. Margaret, my sister-in-law, passed me in the hallway. She stopped, glanced at the basket, then at me, and said under her breath, "You'll never be one of us." Her words were quiet, but sharp as glass. I froze, the basket heavy in my arms, my mouth dry. For a moment I wanted to shout back, to demand what I had done wrong. Instead, I lowered my head and walked past her. When I placed the clothes neatly on the bed, tears blurred my eyes, though I wiped them away quickly before anyone could see. Night after night, I lay awake listening to the silence of the house, the creak of the stairs, the muffled laughter of Thomas's family in the parlor downstairs. Sometimes Thomas joined them, his voice rising cheerfully, while I sat upstairs with the mending, the sound of my needle the only companion. I thought, why does it feel like I am visiting my own home? And yet, I tried to hold on to gratitude. At least I had a roof over my head. At least Thomas was not cruel, not yet. He provided, he worked, he slept beside me. But a marriage is more than a body in the bed, more than food on the table. It is a partnership, and in the quiet corners of my heart, I wondered if I was truly his partner or just another duty he tolerated. There were moments when I caught him looking at me strangely, as though weighing whether I fit the life he had chosen. Once, in the kitchen after a long day, I asked softly, "Thomas, are you happy with me?" He looked startled, then forced a laugh. "Of course, Helen, don't be so serious all the time." But even as he said it, his eyes slid away, and I knew he hadn't answered my question. Looking back, perhaps the signs were always there. The distance, the silence, the lack of warmth. At the time, I convinced myself it was only a phase, that marriage was hard at the beginning. Everyone said it was. Still, at night when I closed my eyes, I prayed. Please, let tomorrow be different. Please, let them see me. I wanted to belong. I wanted to be loved. But even in those early years, something inside me whispered that I was standing on the edge of a story that would break me in ways I could not yet imagine. And that, I suppose, was the beginning of how I became a stranger in my own home. In those first months, I told myself patience was my best ally. If I worked harder, smiled more, and spoke less, perhaps one day the walls of silence would crumble. But instead, the walls only grew thicker until I felt like I was living behind glass. Every morning began the same way. I would rise before dawn, my breath white in the chilly air of that drafty house. I fed the fire in the stove, careful not to wake the others. Then I set to preparing breakfast. The smell of bread rising, bacon sizzling, and coffee brewing filled the kitchen, yet when the family gathered at the table, it was as if my presence dissolved into the background. Thomas would sit at the head of the table, reading the paper, his brow furrowed. His mother perched beside him, her sharp eyes scanning every detail. Margaret often swept in late, her perfume still lingering from wherever she had been the night before. In me, I served the food quietly, sat at the far end, and listened to the scrape of forks on plates without a single word directed my way. One morning, after I set a plate of eggs in front of Thomas, his mother sniffed and muttered, "The yolks are overcooked." I swallowed and said softly, "I'll do better next time." Thomas didn't look up from his paper. I wanted so badly for him to defend me, just once. To say, "It's fine, Mother." Helen worked hard, but those words never came. His silence hurt worse than any insult. By midday, when the dishes were washed and floors scrubbed, I often felt my body heavy with exhaustion. My hands were red and raw from soap, my back stiff from bending. Yet no one seemed to notice. I became invisible, the one who kept the house spinning but never had a place in it. Sometimes I would sneak moments of rest, sitting by the kitchen window with a cup of weak tea. I'd watch the children from the village chasing one another down the lane, their laughter ringing clear. And I would think, when I have children, maybe then I will belong. Maybe then they'll see me not just as a servant, but as family. But that hope was a fragile flame, flickering weaker with each passing day. In the evenings, when Thomas returned from work, I longed to share with him the small burdens that weighed me down. I would wait until we were alone in our room, the lantern casting shadows on the worn wallpaper. "Thomas," I whispered one night, "do you think your mother will ever accept me?" He sighed, loosening his tie, not even meeting my eyes. "Helen, you worry too much. Just keep the peace. That's all that matters." "But it doesn't feel like peace," I murmured. "It feels like silence swallowing me whole." He shook his head, climbed into bed, and muttered, "You're too sensitive." Moments later, he was asleep, while I stared at the ceiling, my chest tight with unspoken words. The house itself seemed to echo my loneliness. The walls were lined with portraits of his family, his parents in their youth, his sister as a child, Thomas himself as a boy. Not once did anyone suggest adding a photo of me. I was there, yet absent, erased before I could even take root. One afternoon, I remember carrying laundry up the stairs. My arms were piled high with folded shirts when Margaret brushed past me, nearly knocking the stack to the floor. She didn't apologize. Instead, she looked me straight in the eye and said, "You should learn your place." My mouth opened, but no sound came. I wanted to shout, to ask her what place that was supposed to be. Instead, I turned and climbed the stairs, my steps heavy. Later, alone in the bedroom, I pressed my face into the clean laundry and cried silently. Days blurred into one another. The rhythm of the house never changed: work, silence, criticism, sleep. My laughter, once so easy, became rare, a stranger's sound. My voice grew quieter, as though the house itself demanded I speak less, until sometimes even I forgot what it sounded like. And Thomas, he remained the same, a man who was present in body but absent in spirit. He came home, he ate, he slept. I could not say he was cruel, not yet, but his indifference cut just as deeply. Love without kindness becomes a hollow shell, and that was what my marriage began to feel like. One evening, as I scrubbed the kitchen floor, my knees aching, Thomas passed by without a word. I looked up at him, desperate for some recognition, some sign that I mattered. But he only walked past, his shoes clicking on the clean wood. That night, lying in bed, I whispered to myself, "Is this what marriage is meant to be? To disappear into someone else's life until you no longer exist?" I wanted to believe things would change, that the seasons would soften their hearts, that Thomas would one day see me. But deep inside, I already knew the silence was only the beginning. Something darker was waiting ahead, and I was walking toward it step by step. When I found out I was carrying a child, I thought everything would finally change. I believed that life, growing inside me, would be the bridge between me and the family that had never fully accepted me. Perhaps, I told myself, a grandchild would soften Thomas's mother's stern face, or draw a smile from Margaret that wasn't filled with scorn. The months of my pregnancy were hard on my body, but sweet in my heart. I spoke to the baby in quiet moments, pressing my hands to my swelling belly. "You'll be my little companion," I whispered, "and maybe, just maybe, you'll make me part of this family." Thomas was proud in his own way, though his pride was quiet. He would mention the baby to his friends, his chest lifting slightly, but at home he remained distant. He didn't ask how I felt, didn't notice when my ankles swelled or when I struggled to carry the heavy pails of water. I tried not to complain. After all, wasn't this what wives were supposed to do? Endure? When the day of the birth finally came, the house was filled with noise. Thomas's mother bustled about, giving orders as though she were the one bringing life into the world. Margaret hovered near the door, her arms crossed, her eyes sharp. Hours of pain tore through me until I thought I would break in half, and then, at last, the sound of a newborn's cry filled the room. "A boy, my boy!" Tears of relief spilled down my cheeks as I held him against me. His skin was warm, his tiny fingers curled tightly around mine. For a moment, everything else disappeared, the cold glances, the silence, the judgment. Here was proof of my love, my sacrifice, my belonging. But even that joy was quickly claimed by others. Thomas's mother snatched the baby from my arms, cooing as though he were hers. "We'll raise him properly," she said firmly. "No spoiling." Margaret peered over her shoulder and smirked. "He looks nothing like Helen." My smile faltered, but I said nothing. I was too weak, too exhausted to fight. In the days that followed, I found myself pushed further to the edges of my own motherhood. If I rocked him too long, I was told, "You'll spoil the child." If I dressed him in a soft blanket, they shook their heads, saying, "He'll grow weak." Even the way I held him was criticized. One night, as I nursed him in the dim light, Thomas's mother entered without knocking. "You're holding him wrong," she snapped. "Here, give him to me." I clutched my son tighter, my voice trembling. "Please, let me care for him. He's mine." Her lips thinned into a line. "He belongs to this family, not just you." Those words pierced deeper than any blade. Not just me, as though I were only a vessel, a shadow, not a mother at all. Despite everything, I found solace in stolen moments. Late at night, when the house finally quieted, I would cradle him against my chest and whisper my love into his tiny ears. His breath was soft, his heartbeat steady. In those moments, I felt whole. He was my reason, my anchor in the storm. But storms do not stay calm for long. Thomas grew busier at work, coming home late, collapsing into bed without asking about the baby. When I tried to share my fears, "They don't let me raise him as I want," he brushed me aside. "They're helping, Helen. Be grateful. You worry too much." "Grateful?" I asked one evening, my voice cracking. "For being treated like a guest in my own son's life?" He frowned, pulled off his boots, and muttered, "You're too dramatic." The rift between us widened, though I tried desperately to mend it. I baked his favorite bread, stitched his shirts with care, smiled even when my heart ached. But every kindness felt swallowed by the house, absorbed into its silence, unnoticed and unreturned. There was one evening I will never forget. My son, barely 3 years old, reached for me as Thomas's mother tried to lead him away. His little arms stretched out, tears filling his eyes. "Mama," he cried, "I want Mama." For a brief, shining second, I felt seen, needed, wanted. But Thomas's mother tightened her grip and said firmly, "Enough of that. You'll confuse him," and they walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway, my arms empty, my heart shattered. That night, when the house was dark, I sat on the edge of my bed, holding my hands tightly together as if I could still feel the weight of my child there. My tears fell silently onto the quilt. I whispered to myself, "How can I feel more like a stranger now, even with my own child?" And somewhere deep inside, I began to realize that this was not just a matter of patience or time. This was a battle for my very place in the world, and I was losing it. The years passed, but nothing changed. If anything, the distance between me and the rest of the family grew deeper. My son was growing, running through the halls with laughter that filled the rooms. His joy was the only light that warmed me, but even that light was dimmed whenever Thomas's mother corrected him or Margaret pulled him away from my embrace. Holidays were the hardest. At Christmas, the house glowed with candles, the table heavy with roasted meats and sweet puddings. Relatives filled the rooms, their voices rising in laughter. I moved quietly among them, refilling cups, clearing plates, making sure everything was perfect. Yet when I tried to join a conversation, the words stumbled to a stop. Faces turned away. It was as though I were a servant who had wandered into the celebration by mistake. I remember one Thanksgiving especially. I had spent the entire morning preparing pies, my hands dusted with flour, the kitchen hot with steam. When the family gathered, Thomas's mother stood at the head of the table, praising Margaret for setting the decorations. Not a word was said about the food, the hours of work, the sweat on my brow. I sat silently, my hands folded in my lap, and listened to the laughter that never reached me. That night, when the guests had gone and the house had quieted, I tried to speak to Thomas. "Why don't they see me?" I asked, my voice trembling. He looked up from his glass, his eyes already dull from drink. "Why must you always complain, Helen? You have a home, food, a child. What more do you want?" "I want to be seen," I whispered. "I want to feel like I belong in my own house." He slammed his glass on the table, the liquid spilling. "You're never satisfied, always finding fault. No wonder they don't warm to you." The sharpness of his words cut deeper than any silence ever had. That night, when he turned away in bed, I curled into myself, feeling smaller than I had ever felt before. As the years wore on, Thomas's temper grew shorter. When he drank, which was often, his patience thinned. At first it was words, sarcasm, sharp remarks, dismissive laughter. Then came the shoves when I stood in his way, the grip on my arm when I spoke too loudly. Once, after a heated argument about money, his hand struck my cheek. I stumbled back, more shocked than hurt. He muttered, "If you just kept quiet, things would be easier." I held my cheek, tears burning, but I said nothing. Silence had become my armor. Even my son began to notice. One evening, as I tucked him into bed, he asked softly, "Mama, why does Papa shout at you?" His innocent eyes looked up at me, full of worry. My throat tightened. I smoothed his hair and forced a smile. "Don't worry, darling. Everything is fine." But inside, I knew nothing was fine. The house that once felt merely cold now felt hostile, as though the walls themselves pressed in on me. I walked its hallways like a ghost, present but unseen, moving carefully so as not to stir the anger or criticism that lingered in every corner. One evening during a family gathering, I carried a tray of tea into the parlor. The room was filled with laughter, Margaret telling some story that had everyone leaning forward. As I entered, the conversation faltered, eyes glancing briefly my way before sliding past me as if I were furniture. I set the tray down, my hands trembling slightly, and stood there for a moment. No one spoke to me. No one thanked me. It was as if I weren't even there. I wanted to scream, to throw the tray, to shout, "I exist." But instead, I walked back into the kitchen, sat at the wooden table, and pressed my face into my hands. The laughter from the other room carried through the walls, bright and cruel. That night, I stood before the mirror in my bedroom, the lamplight flickering. My reflection looked back at me pale, tired, lines forming around eyes that no longer shone. I whispered, "When did I disappear? When did I become a stranger in my own home?" The silence gave no answer. Only the sound of the wind rattling the windows reminded me I was still alive. And in that silence, a realization settled heavy in my chest. This was not a matter of patience or endurance. This was my life being stolen from me, piece by piece, until nothing of Helen remained. But the cruelest truth was this: the worst was yet to come. Years slipped away, and with them, pieces of myself. By the time my son was grown, I hardly recognized the woman I had become. My hair had thinned, my back had curved, and my hands bore the cracks of endless work. But the deepest change was inside me. My laughter was gone, my voice was small, my hope, once stubborn, was all but silent. Yet even the quietest ember can flare when pushed too far. It happened one evening after supper. The family had gathered in the parlor, voices rising in conversation, the firelight casting warm glows across their faces. I stood at the edge of the room, unnoticed as usual, until Margaret looked over at me with that same sharp smirk I had seen for decades. "You've been here all these years," she said, her tone dripping with disdain, "and yet you still don't belong." The words hit harder than a slap. Something inside me broke, or perhaps it finally woke. My chest tightened, my hands shook, and before I knew it, my voice rose louder than it ever had. "No," I said firmly, my eyes blazing. "I do belong. I built this home with my hands. I raised a son under this roof. I've scrubbed these floors until my body ached, cooked meals until my fingers bled, and swallowed your insults day after day. And I will not be invisible anymore." The room fell silent. Every face turned to me, wide-eyed. Even Thomas froze, his glass halfway to his lips. My voice trembled, but I pressed on. "For years, I let you treat me like a stranger. For years, I believed patience would earn me love, but all it did was break me. Not anymore. I am done being silent." Thomas's mother drew in a sharp breath, her lips pursed. "How dare you speak to us like this? How dare you?" I shot back, my voice steady now. "How dare you call this a family when all you ever did was shut me out?" For the first time in decades, I felt my spine straighten, my spirit stand tall. The weight of fear that had pressed me down for so long lifted, if only a little. That night, I packed a small bag, only a few clothes, a photograph of my son as a child, and the quilt I had stitched by hand in my first year of marriage. My son, now a grown man, stood in the doorway watching me. His eyes were filled with confusion and sorrow. "Mama," he said softly, "do you have to go?" I cupped his face in my hands, tears brimming in my eyes. "I have to, my darling. For the first time, I must choose myself." He nodded slowly, though pain shadowed his face. He didn't try to stop me. Perhaps he understood that what I was doing was not abandonment, but survival. As I stepped out into the night, the cold air filled my lungs, sharper and freer than I had ever felt. The house loomed behind me, its windows glowing with the firelight I was leaving behind. For years it had been my prison, but no more. I walked down the road with nothing but the crunch of gravel beneath my shoes and the beating of my heart in my ears. With each step, I felt lighter, as though I were shedding chains that had bound me for half a lifetime. Yes, I was older. Yes, I had little money, no clear plan, no certain future. But I had something I had lost long ago myself. Looking back only once, I whispered into the darkness, "Never again." And though the night was cold, for the first time in years, I felt the warmth of freedom burning inside me. Because family can wound as deeply as strangers. But dignity is something we can only reclaim ourselves. And I had finally reclaimed mine. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it reminds you that no matter how late, no matter how broken, it is never too late to choose yourself.